Good evening. Did you have a good week?
Yes.
Good. So did we. So, before we introduce our guest tonight, I did want to say that both I and Oliver will be available on Monday and Wednesday afternoons before class to talk to anyone about anything going on in the course or otherwise. And some of you have responded to me already. I have a couple of appointments lined up for next week, I think. And please feel free also to contact Oliver, who would be equally happy to set up some time with you. Okay? Also on the website, you may have noticed if you've taken a look at the website lately that we're growing it gradually. There's a preliminary bibliography on there regarding women in science and religion. I stress preliminary, but it's a beginning. This goes back to that first night where somebody asked about why aren't there more women on the board or more women's pictures up there. So that prompted this little exercise. So we're building a bibliography in that area. And then finally, for the undergraduates, I know 2 or 3 can't be here tonight, but just to remind you that on Wednesday nights at 7:30, from 7:30 to 9, we have a kind of a free-form discussion about topics raised on Monday nights, and we kind of have fun sort of seeing where all of that goes. So please feel free to come to that. Are there any questions? Any involving housekeeping? All right, good. Now I'm going to turn it over to Oliver.
Thank you. Today we're really in for a treat. Our speaker is Michael Ruse. Now, I met Michael Ruse 15 years ago so at a conference he couldn't remember. Why should he? But I was very impressed. I mean, there he was giving this lecture. I thought, it's outrageous. It's just fun. I mean, you know, so here's an atheist. Can I say that? Is that fair? An atheist who is fun to talk to and really. Okay, that was a little blunt, but you know what I mean.
No, I don't know what you mean.
Michael is the Lucille Workmeister Professor of Philosophy and Director of the History and Philosophy of Science program at Florida State University. Before that, from 1965 to 2000, he was at the University of Guelph. He was elected fellow into the Royal Society of Canada and the American Association for the Advancement of Science in 1986, and holds at least 3 honorary doctorates, of which I know, probably there are some more, I would say. And yes, as I said, he considers himself, as I understand, an atheist. I mean, he just published or will publish a book that comes out in the fall, a new book on atheism, which should be a treat. But he's really in this conversation with religious folks and theologians. Has been in this conversation for quite a long time, so he knows this field extraordinarily well. In 1981, he was actually one of the key witnesses for the plaintiff in the test case of the state law permitting the teaching of creation science in Arkansas. That's one of these interesting cases where the question of creationism was discussed, and luckily in that case, the federal judge ruled the law unconstitutional. So thank you for that, Michael. In 2001, he presented the different lectures, very prestigious thing to do, and he's also the founder of the Journal of Biology and Philosophy, which in the field of philosophy of biology is really one of the leading journals. So I could go on and on and on, but I think you will find that he does this much better than we can anymore of this endless achievement. So I would like to say thanks for coming, Michael. That was really gracious, and we're happy to have you here. So enjoy this. This is going to be fun.
I must say, they seem very old to be undergraduates. Is it some sort of aging process you have in California? How many of you actually are undergraduates? Woo! Oh, there we are. Yeah, okay. You're all clustered on that side. Is there something wrong with this side? Thanks very much for having me. I'm going to talk on some things which I find very interesting, and I hope that you will find them too. I gather that we're going to have plenty of opportunity for discussion when I've finished, so I'll just plunge right in now. But if anything you sort of miss or something, don't hesitate to stop, but I will keep it going at least for the first half, and then we can open up to discussion. So the question I want to look at tonight, the question I'm asking, and it's all absolutely straightforward, folks. There's no catches in what I'm talking about. The question I'm interested in is, on the one hand, Christianity, and on the other hand, Darwinian evolutionary theory. And my basic question is, are they compatible? If you're a Christian, can you be a full-blooded Darwinian? If you're a Darwinian, can you be a full-blooded Christian? And that's basically the question I've got tonight. There are many people who think that this is not possible. There are many people, both on the side of Darwinism and on the side of religion, who think that this cannot be done. In fact, I come from the deep south. As they say in Florida, the farther north you go in Florida, the deeper south you get. And we're 10 miles from the Georgia border. And I'll tell you that most of the people in the city I live in do not think that they're compatible. So I'm talking about real people, but even more real people. Let's start with Richard Dawkins, the scourge of the sloppy, the English biologist, the Pope of atheism. And Dawkins, in many works, but most recently in his The God Delusion, argues very, very strongly that if in fact you are a scientist, but particularly if you're a Darwinian scientist, then religion and Christianity in particular are just not on. In fact, Dawkins has gone as far as to say that he thinks that bringing a child up Christian is a form of child abuse. So he's quite blunt about that. If you're the one, you cannot be the other. But on the other hand, there are those who share this sentiment. And I will show you a particular American religious figure, the Reverend Pat Robertson, who apparently is on I think he Skypes with God now. It used to be telephone, but now it's Skype. As you may know, in 2005 in the city of Dover, Pennsylvania, the school board decided that some form of creationism, intelligent design theory, could be taught in the schools. And the American Civil Liberties Union brought suit against this on the grounds that it was a violation of the First Amendment of the Constitution, and the judge agreed with them, and so it was thrown out. And the Reverend Pat Robertson had this to say on the subject. He told us that God was not pleased. I'd like to say to the good citizens of Dover, if there is a disaster in your area, don't turn to God. You just rejected him from your city. God is tolerant and loving, but we can't keep sticking our finger in his eye forever. If they have future problems in Dover, I recommend they call on Charles Darwin. Maybe he can help them. So the point I'm making is that there are, in fact, really very strongly opposed views. I should say, to be fair about this, to make the problem even more interesting, there are some very bright people on both sides of the debate. I don't know about the Reverend Pat, but certainly there are many very clever evolutionists, but there are also some very clever intelligent design theorists, creationists. I mean, to take just one example, Philip Johnson, who used to be a law professor across the bay at Berkeley, he was not only a graduate of Harvard and Chicago, but he was a clerk for Earl Warren when he was head of the Supreme Court. So, in other words, these are people, I mean, what makes this interesting, what makes this whole debate interesting, is you don't have brights on the one side and thickies on the other. You've got really very concerned and in many cases really intelligent people who are divided on this issue. And so this is the question I want to ask tonight is, are these people right? And I want to suggest that they're not, but I do want to suggest in trying to show that they're not, the question is rather more interesting than you might think. Okay, so how do we set about doing this? Well, the obvious way is, well, what is Darwinism? What is Christianity? So in 5 minutes flat for each of these positions, what is Darwinism? Well, Darwinism obviously is the brainchild of the English naturalist Charles Robert Darwin, who was born in 1809 and died in 1882. In fact, did you say you were an undergraduate? Yes. He was born on February the 12th, 1809. Who else was born on February the 12th, 1809? That'll teach you to sit on the second row, won't it? Don't you tell her. February the 12th, 1809. Who else was born on February the 12th, 1809?
I will not have an answer for you.
I'm
Yeah, this man's a Jesuit. All right, one of the old codgers at the back. Tell him.
George Bush.
Who? who was born on February the 12th, 1809? Abraham Lincoln. You won't forget that one in a hurry, will you? Get something out of this very expensive education you're getting. Okay. Abraham Lincoln. So Charles Darwin, he was born in 1809, lived to 1882. So in other words, he was basically very much an Englishman, 19th century, if you like. He was a Victorian. Queen Victoria came to the throne in 1837. So he was very much part of the English background. He came from a well-off family. His grandfather was Josiah Wedgwood, the potter, you know, the sort of blue and white pottery. And so, in other words, people often say, oh, well, Darwin must have been an amateur, he never worked. Darwin never had to work. He was, I mean, these people had Silicon Valley kind of money. I mean, these people were really loaded. And what's interesting about Darwin is he could have been like his older brother and done nothing at all. In fact, he became a very good naturalist, a very good biologist, and worked very hard. He went to the University of Cambridge intending to become a clergyman, but he got the offer at the end, as he was finishing his degree, to go off on as sort of ship's naturalist on HMS Beagle, and this is a contemporary painting of the Beagle, which was going to spend some 5 years going around South America. Darwin hadn't done an undergraduate degree in biology, the simple reason there were no undergraduate degrees in biology in those days, but he was interested in natural history. His prof saw this, saw that he was talented, and so he spent some 5 years going around South America. He used to get terribly seasick, so he didn't spend an awful lot of time on the boat. He spent a lot of time crisscrossing while the boat was surveying around the coast. What happened was, on the way home, they decided not to go straight back up the Atlantic, but to go round the Cape and then through the Pacific, and they went all around the world. And in 1835, what happened was they visited the Galapagos Archipelago, this group of islands off the coast of the western coast of South America. They belong to Ecuador now. And when Darwin was there, it was pointed out to him that the birds and the reptiles, and you're seeing some of the giant tortoises there, are different from island to island. And I should say that these islands, in fact, are only some of them are only 10 miles apart. If you go to the Galapagos, you can stand on one island and see other islands. So they're very close together, and yet as I say, the tortoises and the birds are different from island to island. Darwin didn't have a sort of eureka moment. He did not have a sort of Saul on the way to Damascus moment. It was as he thought about it, and when he came home and he brought these specimens of birds back and he gave them to a man to catalogue, and the man said, these are different species. It was at this point that Darwin said the only way you can explain this is that they came to the islands, and then as they went from island to island, they diverged and evolved. And in fact, this is from one of Darwin's private notebooks in 1837, and this is the first little tree of life that he ever drew. And so he became a committed evolutionist, and then he went on to discover the mechanism for which he's best known, which is natural selection. And what makes natural selection really interesting is, first of all, Darwin, who came from rural England, he came from Shropshire, and so Darwin knew all about animal breeding. And remember, we're talking 1835, 1837 now. The Industrial Revolution in England has just got second wind. The first part of the Industrial Revolution is at the end of the 18th century, when you've got particularly cotton mills. And then what happens is the Napoleonic Wars come along, and then after the Napoleonic Wars end in 1815 with the Battle of Waterloo, then things start to pick up again, and the Industrial Revolution starts all over again, and particularly as it happens with railways. Railways are the big thing. And of course, with an Industrial Revolution, you've got a lot of people living in cities rather than on the farms, which means that your agriculture has got to be a lot more efficient. So you can only have an Industrial Revolution if you've had an agricultural revolution. And one of the big things in an agricultural revolution is to be much more efficient in your breeding. And so Darwin knew all about artificial selection. And what he realized, of course, what made it really interesting, was that artificial selection didn't just change organisms, but it changed them in the directions that you want. You designed the organism that you wanted. It was a question of design. Now, Darwin had gone to Cambridge to become a clergyman, and Darwin, therefore, had encountered what we philosophers call natural theology. And in particular, he'd encountered the so-called argument from design for the existence of God. Namely, the eye is like a telescope. Telescopes have telescope makers. Therefore, the eye, which is design-like, must have been really designed. And who designed the eye? Well, it must be the great optician in the sky. So Darwin very much was thinking in these terms. He thought that organisms were design-like. Artificial selection designs organisms, and so then Darwin thought in terms of natural selection, that maybe there's a process akin to artificial selection going on in the real world. Now, how does this come about? Well, because of the population explosion that's always going on, and this was something that's pointed out to him by the Reverend Thomas Robert Malthus. And so you've got this population explosion. There isn't going to be enough food and space for everybody, so some are going to get through, as it were. Some are going to be breeders, and some are not. In other words, some are just going to get, you're going to have lots of offspring, a happy life of shagging, while meanwhile, he's going to be just a weedy little runt who dies early, you see. And so what you're going to get is the design process is going to go on in your direction rather than his. And so you get this kind of natural selection, which is an equivalent of artificial selection. And this leads to organisms being design-like. And I'm showing you, actually, a couple of the birds that Darwin would have seen on the Galapagos. They're now called Darwin's finches. They were not called Darwin's finches when he went there. He didn't go there and say, oh my goodness, I've been hoping to see Darwin's finches. Here they are. They're called after Darwin. And I draw your attention to the really interesting thing about these birds, namely their beaks are very big and strong, and the reason is these birds eat cactus and that sort of thing. There are other Darwin's finches which have very fine beaks, they're insectivorous, and there are even Darwin's finches which pick up sticks with their beaks and poke around to get grubs. They're tool users. So in other words, natural selection speaks to the design-like nature of organisms, just as artificial selection does. And this, given enough time, leads to evolution. And then finally, for reasons we're still not sure about, Darwin sat on his ideas for about 20 years, and then finally he published them in this work on the origin of species by means of natural selection by Charles Darwin, and he published it in 1859. Just an aside, this is actually a copy that of an original. I mean, it's not a copy. It's original that we have at Florida State. Nobody's quite sure where we got it from. It was probably given to us in the 1960s. It's a beautiful copy. The origin is not a rare book. 1,250 copies were printed, and we think there are about 750 copies still around. It's not a rare book. I could get you a copy tomorrow if you wanted it. It is, however, a rather expensive book, and something as good as this would probably cost you about $200,000. In other words, roughly 4 years of undergraduate education. And, believe it or not, they throw in the information about Abraham Lincoln's birthday. You get that as a bonus if you buy this, okay? Anyhow, so there's the origin. So this is Darwin's theory of evolution through natural selection. Now, there's been huge numbers of changes from that day to this, but basically, this is still the theory that we have today. What we add on to it is genetics, of course. Darwin knew nothing about genetics. This was being worked out by well, it's now in the Czech Republic, but he was part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Gregor Mendel was working out these ideas at the same time. Very interesting. People often say, what a pity Darwin and Mendel didn't get together. Darwin didn't know about Mendel, but Mendel knew all about Darwin, and Mendel actually read, and we have, Mendel's copy of The Origin still exists. As soon as it was translated into German, Mendel got a copy and wrote all along the side. But what he was writing about was not, oh, I've got the solution that Darwin wants. What he was writing about was, can I, as a Catholic priest, accept evolution? That was his problem situation. He decided he could. The other nice thing is, it's possible that Darwin and Mendel were in the same room at the same time. There was a big congress, I think, in 1863 in London, and we know that Mendel went to it. And Darwin, although he was very sick, often went to these things. So it's possible they were in the same room. Of course, what would have happened was people would have said to Mendel, oh, that's Darwin, that's Darwin. I mean, Darwin wouldn't have gone in there and said, where's that man Mendel who's doing the work I need? I mean, so they really were ships passing in the night. So this is Darwinism then. Evolution, natural selection, I won't say no God, but what I would say is, as science, it's what the terms we use, it's methodologically atheistic. Doesn't mean to say it's metaphysically, we're going to have to talk about that. But I'm not saying that it's metaphysically atheistic, but it's certainly methodologically atheistic in the sense that God doesn't come into it. A little more qualified than that. In fact, there are, I think, 12 references to the Creator here in this work. We know at this point, when Darwin published The Origin, he was no longer a Christian, but he was certainly a deist. He believed in a God as unmoved mover. Probably in the next 10 or 15 years, the rest of his faith went and he became something of an agnostic. And if you get to the Descent of Man, there's not those kinds of references. But it was very easy. And Darwin was never, ever a new atheist. He would have thought atheism and new atheism incredibly vulgar. You know, that wasn't, I mean, it would not have been compatible with him as an English gentleman to behave in that sort of way. He wouldn't want to conceal his non-belief, but it would not be appropriate, as it were, to shove it to you in a Dawkins sort of fashion. And of course, what happened when Darwin died in 1882, without any question, Darwin was buried in Westminster Abbey, and the Dean of Westminster said, of course he's going to be buried here. He's an English hero. So, you have to understand that Darwin's own personal relationship with religion it's a little more nuanced, let me put it that way. It's not terribly complicated, but it's a little more nuanced. And certainly, Darwin was never, ever an atheist. Pretty clearly, he was an agnostic by the end of his life. But certainly, most of the time, he was a deist of some kind like that. Now, what about Christianity? 5 minutes on Darwin. What about Christianity? Okay, I am not going to ask you who was born on the same day as Jesus Christ, okay? Relax on that. Relax on that one, okay? Boy, you hate me, don't you? What about Christianity? Well, of course, Christianity is a religion which comes out of Judaism. It's a form. It is a what should we say, a variant, if you like, an outgrowth of Judaism. I mean, of course, as people know, there was a lot of discussion when Christians came along as to what extent they should accept Judaism, and there was a lot of discussion went on. But I think it was particularly St. Augustine said, look, we can't make sense of Christianity without Judaism, so, folks, this is part of our religion. So you've got the Jewish background, and then, of course, you've got Jesus, who, let's not get into dates, but, roughly 2,000 years ago, give or take, a year or two, or something like that. And then, and again, I don't particularly want to get into major discussions about who was Jesus and those sorts of things. I don't think any serious scholar, for instance, today, I mean, there are certainly those who doubt that Jesus existed. I think that all serious scholars, believers or not, would say that the evidence that Jesus existed is really pretty secure. It's pretty secure that he preached, and it's pretty secure that he ran into trouble with the Romans and got himself crucified. Now, after that, an awful lot is up for grabs, and I think everybody would agree that certainly when Jesus died, there was no religion of Christianity. And of course, there's a lot of discussion today amongst believers about exactly what Jesus intended, what Jesus thought he was himself, for instance, and issues of this kind. But I think it's pretty clear that it was after Jesus that Christianity started to form as his followers tried to make sense of who he was and what he did and all of these things. And of course, the key man above all, of course, was St. Paul, who spent a great deal of his time not only preaching to others, but particularly in the epistles, particularly in Romans, trying to, as it were, put it all together and put the context of Jesus and what it meant to be a Christian and what behaviour is expected of us as Christians. And of course, we were talking about this today, Paul didn't do all the work. It took 300-400 years, I think, for Christians to argue out a lot of things, and a lot of things which a lot of Christians believed early on lost out, and now they're declared as heresies. Other things won. And I think beyond all others, this man, St. Augustine, around about 400 AD, is the key man for putting it all together. I love this picture of St. Augustine. He's normally portrayed a little bit like me, in a bed sheet, sort of old and doddery and that sort of thing. But, he was really quite a lad in his youth. Oh God, make me good, but not just yet. That's St. Ambrose who converted him up here. And this was his mother, St. Monica, who nagged the poor man to hell until he actually said, okay, Mom, I give up, I'll become a Christian. But it was particularly, I think, St. Augustine who was the one who articulated and helped to form what Christianity was going to be about. And, for instance, things like the relationship of Christianity to the Old Testament and things like that. I mean, why the Old Testament? Well, why did Jesus die on the cross? For our sins. Why are we sinful given that we're the creation of a good God? Well, because we sinned. Well, how do we know that? Because of the Genesis story, and so on and so forth. But of course, Christianity didn't stop there, and it's gone on evolving. If I use the word evolving, I don't necessarily mean changing, but certainly, let us say, developing over the years. After Augustine, probably the key figure of all time, St. Thomas Aquinas, almost 1,000 years after that. And then, of course, as we all know, Christianity divided and split in the 16th century, and one got the great reformers coming along, Martin Luther, and then, I love this picture, John Calvin. So, basically then, I take this to be, and I'm joking a little bit, but I take this to be Christianity. Christianity believes in a creator God. One of the things about it, it's the Jewish God, so it's a creator. It's not just a designer. I mean, for instance, Plato in the Timaeus has a designer, the demiurge. The Christian God is, of course, a designer, but he's also the creator out of nothing. It it is a religion which at least, and we're going to talk a bit more about this before we finish, it's a religion which of course has a special place for humans. We are made in the image of God. Doesn't mean to say we're the only things that God cares about. We're told that he cares about every sparrow. But certainly humans have a pretty starring role in this. It is a religion which sees us as in some sense sinful. We could only be sinful if we had freedom. Machines, a falling rock may kill you, but a falling rock is not at fault. Because a falling rock makes no decisions. It's only if you're free. That's what makes Hitler so awful, is that he freely chose to do what he did. So it's certainly a religion which puts an emphasis on freedom. It puts an emphasis on our fallen nature. And of course, it's a religion which believes that God so loved the earth that he brought his only begotten Son. God himself came and suffered for our sins. Now, an awful lot of this, I would say an awful lot of this, doesn't really have a hell of a lot to do with Darwinism. John Henry Newman, the great English theologian of the 19th century, said, you know, a lot of this discussion about Darwinism, he said, you know, it's irrelevant to what I believe. It's not a question of conflicting with it. It's, you know, I'm concerned with God who so loved me, a sinner, that he died on the cross for my sins. I don't see that Darwinism is saying a damn thing about that. It's not that it's asserting it or denying it. It's just not about that. And so I think we have to take that as a context and recognize that when we're going to talk about Darwinism versus Christianity, at a certain level, there's an awful lot of the discussion which, you know, it doesn't mean to say it isn't important to Christians or it isn't important to Darwinians, but it's not important to the, if you like, the clash or the debate between them. And so if one is rather selective, it's not because you think they're unimportant. I mean, things like the Trinity, for instance. You know, what does the Trinity mean? What does it mean to say it's one substance? And that sort of thing. Darwinism doesn't have a dog in that fight. So I mean, it can be, these can be issues which are very important to Christians, but they're not necessarily issues that Darwinism impinges on. I think it's important to keep that in mind, because often there's just this feeling that everything that the two sides say are in conflict. And the point is, there's a hell of a lot that the two sides say which just aren't, you know, they're not about these sorts of things. Okay, so keep that in mind. So now the question then is, well, where are we going to find conflict? Where is there conflict? Where's this interesting conflict? Where are some of the issues which are worth talking about? And I'm just going to pick three out. I don't think they're the only ones. I do think that they're particularly interesting. I'm not saying they're the most important, but I do think that they are important, certainly. I want to talk about the whole question of the literalness of the Bible and those sorts of questions. I want to talk about the problem of evil, which I think is the biggie in many respects. And as I said, I want to talk about the status of humans at the end, which I find myself particularly intriguing, but I'll come to that. So the first thing then is, what about the Genesis issue? And of course, is the Bible the Word of God? And of course Christians say yes, it is. I think every Christian would want to say yes. That's, you know, that comes with the territory, folks. The Bible is the Word of God. Is it true in every word? Well, I think most Christians at some level would want to say yes, it is. There's no question. It's inspired. That's the word that's used. What does it mean to say that? But of course, what does it mean to say that it's true? And of course, this is where, you know, the rubber hits the road. Because at least since St. Augustine, and earlier than that, Christians have been saying, you know, folks, you don't necessarily have to take every word in the Bible as literally true. I mean, now, I'm not saying that St. Augustine would have denied Noah's flood, but the point is, St. Augustine set it up so that if there are reasons to doubt the literal existence of a flood and the literal existence of Noah, you don't have to spend the rest of your religious career trying to work out how much poo each hippopotamus produces per day and how you get rid of it. Which, don't laugh, folks, if you go to the Creationist Museum in Cincinnati, and I well recommend it, they've got a very good cafe. They've nice cup of tea you get there. But these are the sorts of issues these people are really worrying about. How much poo is produced per day on the ark, and how do they get rid of it? These are serious issues. Well, of course they're serious issues. Well, St. Augustine, I think, right from the beginning, and I think if I use the word traditional Christian, the word I'd like to use is orthodox, but of course that gets me into problems. I'm not talking about Eastern Christians. I think certainly traditional Christianity has, almost from the start, had built in, yes, the Bible is true, but being true does not necessarily mean literally true. It could well be allegorically or metaphorically true. And St. Augustine made the very good point. Remember, he's 400 AD. He said, I'm a sophisticated Roman. I know about science. I know about philosophy. I know about these sorts of things, myths and these things. God was dealing with Abraham and with Isaac, nomadics who were illiterate. Sure, they were very religious men, but they were not sophisticated Romans 400 AD. The kind of thing that this young woman would say, well, they're very nice, but they're at Florida State. They're not at Stanford, They may know all about the birth date of Abraham Lincoln, but anyhow, that's what I think. So the point I'm trying to make is it has always, I think, in many respects, this whole debate about the Bible as literally true and that sort of thing is something of a red herring. This whole business of biblical literalism is, in fact, very much a creation of American Protestants in the first half of the 19th century who had particular reasons for doing these sorts of things and that sort of thing. And of course, what shows the hypocrisy of those who say, no, everything must be understood literally, is that no Christian, even the most evangelical of Christians, has ever taken the Bible as literally true in every word. This is the whore of Babylon, who stars in Revelation. No evangelical has ever thought that the whore of Babylon is a literal woman. Immediately, what they all say is, oh, well, the whore of Babylon stands for, usually, for the Catholic Church, or for the Pope, or in earlier years, for Saladin. Saddam Hussein was a popular one. Jonathan Edwards, the great American Presbyterian preacher of the 18th century, I again thought it was something to the east and something not very nice, which was threatening to Christianity. If you learn any evangelical about the whore of Babylon, as I say, these days, of course, they're all, matey-matey with the Pope because of abortion. So they usually want to push it somewhere. I imagine Vladimir Putin is Putin, or however you pronounce it now, Putin. I imagine, I wouldn't be at all surprised if the blogs aren't flying, whether or not, the leader of Russia isn't in fact the whore of Babylon, and now we really know. This is what goes on. So the point I'm making is I really don't think this whole question of literalism is anything like as important as people talk about. Now, I don't mean that there aren't issues. And certainly, and I'm not really going to talk about it now, but we might want to bring it up in discussion. There's an awful lot of discussion about the literal nature of Adam and Eve. And the point is, modern science says there wasn't just two people who sort of existed and started everything. And I think a lot of Presbyterians, for instance, at places like Calvin College, are finding it very, very difficult to wrestle with the idea that Adam and Eve were symbolic or something like that. That's the Augustinian position. Irenaeus of Lyon, before St. Augustine, had a different view, which is, I gather, very much more popular with the Orthodox Christians. But certainly the Western view, the Augustinian notion of original sin, does make a big thing out of the literal fall. And so I'm not saying that there are no issues, but certainly overall, I don't think that this is anything like as big as people often claim it to be. Well, what about the problem of evil? Anne Frank dies in Bergen-Belsen. How can you believe in an all-loving, all-powerful God in the face of something like that? And in fact, this was a problem that worried Darwin. I mean, Darwin was pretty sophisticated theologically. I mean, he'd had some training, quite a bit of training at Cambridge. So without wanting to say that he was a serious theologian, Darwin knew his way around a lot of these sorts of issues. And he writes this, in fact, to his great friend Asa Gray, the professor of botany at Harvard. And I think this letter is either 1859 or 1860. It's just after The Origin has come out. And Asa Gray is a dedicated Presbyterian. And Darwin writing to Asa Gray and saying, I don't not believe in God, but he says, I really do have problems. I cannot persuade myself that a beneficent and omnipotent God would have designedly created the, and I can never pronounce this properly, Icumen noni die, with the express intention of their feeding within the living bodies of caterpillars, or that a cat should play with mice. And so Darwin's saying, I really do have a lot of problems with the issue of evil. Actually, he then goes on to say, but I still believe in a God of some sort. And this is 1859, 1860. As I say, probably the 10 years after it starts to fade. Although, very interestingly, Darwin, like a lot of Victorians, lost his faith less for the philosophical or scientific issues and more on theological grounds, particularly eternal damnation. Eternal damnation stuck in the craw of an awful lot of very respectable people. They could not believe that somebody who was a genuine non-believer would be condemned to everlasting damnation because they came sincerely to these beliefs. And Darwin's own father was a doctor, and Darwin thought incredibly highly of his father. He thought his father was a wonderful man, but his father was a non-believer. And Darwin said, he said, I just cannot accept a religion which makes my father go to hell because my father genuinely and sincerely cannot accept Jesus as his saviour. He said, if that's Christianity, he said, I don't want any part of it. And I do want to say that this was a very, very, very common pattern. If you look at the biographies of people like George Eliot or a lot of these people who lost their faith, it was usually on theological grounds rather than something to do with science or even, dare I say, philosophical grounds. Well, what about the problem of evil? Well, I think what you need to do is that, and here I am going to sound like a philosopher, you need to divide the problem of evil into the two parts which is normally done, moral evil and natural evil. Moral evil is Auschwitz. It's something that people do. Natural evil is earthquakes, the Lisbon earthquake of what was it, 1750 or something, just up 1756 or something like that. So natural evil is earthquakes. Well, what's the solution? What's the Christian solution to moral evil? Well, moral evil is explained by free will. In other words, God doesn't want Anne Frank to die in Bergen-Belsen, but it's better that Hitler and his cronies, like the rest of us, have free will, even though that sort of thing is going to happen. A world with free will is a better world than a world with us all being robots, even though it leads to horrendous ends. And the point I want to make is, well, does Darwinism deny this? Now, please understand what I'm saying now. I'm not arguing that Christianity is true, okay? I'm not arguing that the problem of evil is soluble. I'm not saying that. Personally, I don't think it is. Personally, I don't want Christianity to be true, quite frankly. I don't want to have to believe in a God who let Anne Frank die in Bergen-Belsen. But that's another matter. That's not what the question I'm addressing tonight. The question I'm addressing tonight is, does Darwinism disprove Christianity on the grounds of free will? That's the question I want to ask. And the question then is, does Darwinism allow for some kind of notion of freedom? In other words, can you be a Darwinian and believe in free will? Now, I should say, very interestingly, there are Darwinians who feel very strongly that if you believe in Darwinism, you cannot believe in free will. A man called Jerry Coyne, I don't know how many of you have come across his blog, it's called Why Evolution is True. He's a professor of biology at Chicago, and I want to say it's a blog which is well worth reading. He's got a bit of an obsession with cats. I'm a dog person myself, but I won't hold that against him. But so there are certainly people who think that Darwinism is incompatible with any kind of freedom in genuine. There are other Darwinians who think you can believe in Darwinism and believe in free will. Dan Dennett, one of the four horsemen, as they call them, of the new atheists, believes in that. So now where do I stand on this? And I want to say, yes, I think not only can a Darwinian believe in a form of free will, but in certain respects, it seems to me, Darwinism almost demands freedom in some sort of respect. Now, I should say, so in other words, my question is, does Darwinism make free will impossible? Well, about 30 years ago, a lot of people, particularly people like Stephen Jay Gould at Harvard and his colleague Richard Lewontin, were saying, no, the trouble with Darwinism is that it promotes genetic determinism. Now, one was never quite sure what genetic determinism meant, except it was a bad thing. But basically the idea was, the trouble with Darwinism is it says we're all locked into what we are because of our genes. In other words, you're a woman, so you're going to be, interested in, vacuum cleaning and that sort of thing. And you're a man, and you're going to be interested in gunning down people, which is apparently the American way, or at least it is in Florida. But, in other words, it's not that you choose freely to like vacuum cleaners. It's just part of your biological destiny. And it's not that you like to gun down innocent, people who are walking down the street and ignoring you. It's just part of your biological destiny to do this sort of thing. That's genetic determinism. Well, yes, you're giggling because it's total bullshit, isn't it? I mean, it really is. I mean, Darwinism doesn't like that at all. Of course it doesn't. I mean, certainly Darwinism says that we're going to have certain characteristics, but it doesn't follow that we're going to be without any notion of free will whatsoever. Sure, there are things which are going to be genetically determined. The ants are a case in point. Ants do not, I mean, if you want to use another metaphor, ants are, if you like, pre-programmed to do what they do. They don't think about what they're going to do, they do it. And the example I like is one that Edward O. Wilson, the sociobiologist at Harvard, who's a big ant man, showed me. And you go into, when he had his lab still going, you go into his lab, he had this big tray, and in it he had a colony of leafcutter ants. It was, it was a tray about this size and the same or twice that going the other way. And he had this colony. He'd had it for 10, 15 years. And his party trick, you see, the colony was at one end of the tray, and the rest of the tray was open. And his party trick was to take a leaf and put it in the tray and say, watch what happens. And what you would find is that there are foragers always going around looking for food. And they would find this leaf. And what they would then do is immediately go back immediately to the nest. And then within seconds, another cast would come out, the leaf cutters would come out, and they'd find the leaf, they'd follow the trail, they'd find the leaf, they would cut it up and carry it home. And then inside, as Ed said, what would happen is then the gardeners would grow fungus on it, and then they'd pass the fungus over to the nursery people, and so it all went. And there were great big soldiers around hovering all the time anyway. So you'd see this, it was miraculous. And then Wilson would say, now, let me show you another trick. Okay, he'd put the leaf there, and before long you'd have this trail going up and down. And he'd say, now, wet your finger like that, and do it very quickly. Draw your finger at right angles across the trail. Be quick, because the soldiers are there looking for you. And of course, what would happen is that the ants on the leaf side would get to where you'd done it, and instead of going home, they'd now start to mill up and down there. And the ants coming out, instead of finding the leaf, would start to mill up. And of course, the reason why was nobody was thinking about what they were doing. They were following chemical trails. They were following pheromones. And as soon as you broke it, they were stuck. In other words, they really were genetically determined. Now the thing is, and Wilson would point this out himself, the thing is, humans cannot afford to be genetically determined in that sort of way. We can't afford to, it's great when ants can afford to do it because a female has 1 million offspring. She can afford to lose 10,000 in a rain shower. It doesn't matter because there's plenty more. But if I say to you, Oliver, how many kids have you got, Oliver? And he says, well, I've got 3. And then he says, no, stop it. 2 of them just went to McDonald's and it's been raining. Better just say 1. I mean, yeah, there are days, let me tell you. There are days when, if a rain shower would stop them from coming back from McDonald's, I would be praying for rain. But, by and large, we don't want our kids to get lost because God does this or the rain does that. In other words, we have so few offspring, we can't afford to be genetically determined. We have to have within us some kind of mechanism which can respond to things going wrong. Doesn't mean to say we're not overall, but it doesn't mean to say that we're not part of the cause and effect network. But we have to have a dimension of freedom. It's what philosophers call compatibilism. And David Hume is a great promoter of this. But so humans, I'm just talking about the best kind of humans, obviously, but humans have to have some kind of dimension of freedom. And Darwinian theory promotes this. Darwinian theory, far from denying this, insists on this because of the kind of reproductive strategy we've taken. Instead of having lots of offspring, but not educating them, but letting it all happen, if something goes wrong, you can lose a few. We have just a few. But we've got to have some mechanism of responding, and that, of course, is what freedom is all about. In other words, if you turn to humans, the evolution of humans demands that, as it were, we've got these, if you like, onboard computers which enable us to revise if something goes wrong. Or the analogy I like, and this is Dan Dennett's analogy, so I love to use the new atheists against themselves. This is Dan Dennett's analogy. He says, ants are like simple rockets. You fire them off, and if something goes wrong, well, you've lost it, but they're cheap. You can do this. If the target moves, well, it doesn't hit it, but there's plenty more where it comes from. We're much more like Mars rover, where Mars rover, if it beats a rock, can't just give up. It has, if you like, to decide what to do. And of course, what Mars rover does is it meets a rock and it says, oh, a rock. Instead of going forward, I will go this way, and then this way, and then this way, and then this way. In other words, it's all part of the causal network, but it's got a kind of dimension of freedom, which the simple rocket doesn't have. So what I'm saying is, at least as far as the moral evil issue is concerned, it seems to me that Darwinism has within itself the resources to deal with that sort of issue. I mean, I'm not saying that free will is a good argument against moral evil. What I am saying is I don't think that Darwinism shoots down the basic Christian argument. Well, what about natural evil? Well, basically, the argument here is one which usually goes back to Leibniz in the late 17th, early 18th century. And Leibniz pointed out that to say that God is all-powerful doesn't mean to say that God could do everything. God could not make 2 + 2 = 5. God could not make a rock which was so heavy that nobody could lift it and then make somebody who could lift it. In other words, God can't do contradictions. And what Leibniz pointed out is that in creating the world, a lot of it is balance. Is pain, let's say, from burning a good thing or bad thing? Well, it's not a very nice thing, but if you need a warning about fire or knives or that sort of thing, pain's a pretty good way of doing it. In other words, what Leibniz said is pain, if you look at it in the overall balance, pain may seem like a bad thing, but in fact, if pain means you don't sort of sit on the stove and then it heats up and you say, my God, the chicken smells nice tonight, but in fact it's your butt sizzling on the stove. Here's a man who's old enough to know about these sorts of things, because he used to go to his grandmother's place where they used to have those sorts of stoves. Pain matters. So Leibniz's position was that, in fact, to say that God is all-powerful doesn't mean to say that God can do anything. It's a question of balances. Now, here's the very interesting argument. What about the eye? And here's Richard Dawkins. As I say, I love to use these people against themselves. How does the eye get produced? The eye, as I pointed out, is design-like. The eye is not just randomly thrown together. Now, if you come into a room and you see stuff randomly thrown on the floor, say, in the good old days, you kids wouldn't know what chalks are. But in the good old days, profs used to write on the board with chalks. If you came into the room and there was just a pile of chalks just like that, and it just, you'd say, well, they just fell. But if you came in and the chalks were carefully put in order so that they made sense, like, say, which said something like Berkeley is better, Berkeley is better than Stanford, or something like that. You wouldn't think it was just random. You'd think that somebody, not a nice person, obviously, not a wise person, obviously, but somebody had obviously come in and done that. In other words, something like this doesn't happen by chance. And Dawkins says, well, how could it happen? And the only way is either designer, which you rule out, or, and what Dawkins wants to say, is the only way you could get this would be through natural selection. The only mechanism that we know that actually creates design-like effects is natural selection. In other words, natural selection, if God was creating, natural selection may lead to pain and suffering. But if God wanted to create the world, and he wanted to do it naturally, and he wanted to make things which worked, then maybe God didn't have any choice but to use natural selection. In other words, it was do nothing or natural selection with all its problems. So again, I'm not saying that this is a good argument. I'm not saying that Leibniz is, Voltaire was very funny about Leibniz's argument about the best of all possible worlds and that sort of thing. What I want to say is I don't see that Darwinism shoots it down. If anything, I think Darwinism supports it. And here's my third thing, I've almost finished. Here's the third thing. That's Dawkins on the blind watchman. Humans are special. Now, it seems to me that humans don't have to exist. God did not have to create humans. If God's all-powerful, that's God's choice. God could have, just created a world of warthogs. If God was into warthogs, God could have said, we've got a nice earth here, let's make warthogs. Let's have big warthogs and small warthogs and pretty warthogs. Well, there is no such thing as a pretty warthog, but let's get into warthogology. God could have done this if he'd wanted to. It's God's choice. But God said, no. He said, I want a creature made in my own image. In other words, I want humans. So, in other words, and of course, to be made, what does it mean to be made in God's image? Well, Augustine is our guide here. It means that we're intelligent, and it means that, and part of being intelligent means that we're moral beings, and we're beings with free will, and all of those sorts of things. I don't think it means. I think we could possibly be green. I think we could possibly have 6 fingers or something like that. I think if God could have lived with that. But I'm not sure about sexuality, or 3 sexes or whatever. But certainly I think if you're going to have the Christian story, then the arrival of humans is not contingent. You understand? Within the context, I'm saying, of the Christian story, it seems to me that humans are not a voluntary add-on. I think you could have had the Christian story, let us say, I'm not sure if you could have the Christian story without dogs, but you could certainly have the Christian story without cats. It may be an impoverished world, but I think one could have had the Christian story without cats, but certainly without warthogs, but I'm not sure that you could have the Christian, no, you couldn't have the Christian story without humans. Now, okay, so God's got to have humans. I think that Christianity demands that. The question is, how does God get humans? And if you take Darwinian evolutionary theory seriously, then God had to get it through evolution, through natural selection. And what I see is, here I think we've got a real problem. I'm not sure that we can solve it. I'll give you one suggestion. I'll give you 2 suggestions. I'll give you a popular suggestion, which I don't think works, and I'll give you an off the top of the head suggestion that I think is pretty good, but I've never found anybody else who agrees with me. But lonely geniuses are used to being lonely. That was a nasty laugh I got. The undergraduates are all writing it down because it might be on the test. So you old codgers who are laughing, I don't appreciate this, I bet you're not paying full fees either. Okay, so what I want to say is humans then are in some sense necessary within the Christian scenario. But I'm suggesting that Darwinism poses a big problem for this, because Darwinism suggests that we didn't have to evolve. And so the question is, what does Darwinism say about this? So God created man in his own image. In the image of God created he him, male and female, he created them. So in other words, what I'm saying is humans or human-like beings had to exist. Well, Gould is one who says it's just not possible. Gould is somebody who says you cannot assume within the Darwinian picture that once you've got evolution going, you see, a lot of us think once you've got evolution going, humans are bound to evolve because we're the best. And the best is, obviously, evolution is going up, fish, amphibians, reptiles, mammals, and then, you get up to the higher apes, and then you get up to humans, and then you get to Americans, and then you get, to Canadians, and then you get the British right at the top. That's not a joke, son, that's not a joke. You get male white Brits right at the top. Or at least Darwin thought you did. Okay, so look what Gould says. Since dinosaurs were not moving towards markedly larger brains, and since such a prospect may lie outside the capabilities of reptilian design, we must assume that consciousness would not have evolved on our planet if a cosmic catastrophe had not claimed the dinosaurs as victims. In other words, he's saying, if the dinosaurs were still around, there's no reason to think the mammals would have flourished, and if the mammals wouldn't have flourished, we wouldn't have flourished. And so, in an entirely literal sense, we owe our existence as large reasoning mammals to our lucky stars. And of course, what he's joking about is the comet which hit the Earth 62 million years ago. In other words, Gould say it's purely contingent that we arrived. But what I want to say is, and I think, that seems to be prima facie what Darwinism suggests. And I want to say, if that's true, then I think Christianity is in deep trouble. Because I think Christianity cannot allow for, it's no good you're shaking your head like that, Oliver. I'm not going to be put off before I got to my final words. So, interestingly, Richard Dawkins, who, I really don't think that Dawkins is a Christian or a quasi-Christian or somebody who wants to be a Christian, or somebody who's going to convert on their deathbed. Although it would be wonderful if he did. But I really don't. But I'm often struck by the extent to which Dawkins, who had a very conventional Anglican, what you'd call Episcopalian background, often his thinking, his atheistic thinking, is so very often almost put in the Christian context. And so, for instance, Christians make humans very important. Dawkins makes humans very important. I don't mean that Dawkins is trying to slip in Christianity. I don't mean that. But what I'd say is he's using the same tropes, the same metaphors. Often I see the same, almost, the same categories. He's not the only one. I mean, I'm not the first person to point this out. But often when you're dealing with Darwinians, you often see it's a bastard offspring of Christianity. I mean, people say, oh, you should talk about other religions. Fair enough. But Darwinism is not a bastard offspring of Buddhism or Islam or even Judaism. It's a bastard offspring, if you're going to use that word, of Christianity. And so often you find that Darwinians are using the same sorts of categories, and particularly this whole business of the importance of humans. Edward O. Wilson is another one who had a big Christian background, but for whom humans, at some level, come out as top. Now, how do you get this? Well, Dawkins relies on what biologists today call arms races, that you get these competing lines of organisms, and they improve each other relative. The antelope goes quickly, the leopard or the cheetah goes faster. So the antelope evolves to go faster. So what you get is faster. Or the predator, let's say the snail, gets better at boring through the clam's shell, so the clam gets a thicker shell. So the snail gets better boring apparatus, and you get this kind of arms race. And Dawkins argues that this is what happens, but that in real life arms races, what happens is they get more and more electronic. If you look at the last century, what you get is, you go from those very thick ship's hulls to using computers and those sorts of things. And Dawkins argues that what you get in arms racing is bigger and better, so this is the kind of arms race. And what you get is humans have the biggest onboard computers. And so in other words, arms races are going to end up electronically and with the best. And so, in other words, what Dawkins wants to argue is that humans are naturally going to evolve out of arms races. So, yeah, Darwinism does produce some kind of progressivism, to which I can only say, I just don't see this. It seems to me that it might go this way, but it might go other ways. I mean, the point about Darwinism is it's opportunistic. Having onboard computers is very expensive. Having humans, you might say, well, we're just the best. Yes, but, other than undergraduates at American universities, by and large, being a vegan, is not a wise life choice. I know it's awkward as hell for professors who try to serve food to their students. Oh my God, I'm a vegan. No, I'm lactose intolerant. I'm a vegetarian. No, Christ. Try and think of what you can serve these buggers. It's impossible. Porridge oats with soy milk and no sugar on the top. It's awful. But anyhow, I digress. What I'm trying to say is, evolution humans have large expenses, and it might not be the best way always to evolve. What I'm saying is, I just don't see the necessary emergence of humans through arms races. And if you don't have the necessary thing, then I would want to argue that Christianity, really has problems, because I want to say that humans have to occur. They didn't have to occur, but if you're going to have Christianity, then they had to occur. Here's another suggestion, as I say. My suggestion is this. God is outside time, space and time. That's Augustine. That God is not one of the chaps. God is like mathematics. God is outside time. So God is not sitting around waiting for things to happen and that sort of thing. 1,000 years in thy sight is but as yesterday when it is past, and as a watch in the night. But beloved, be not ignorant of one thing, that one day is with the Lord as 1,000 years, and 1,000 years of one day. Incidentally, here's another nice little footnote. I expect you've all heard of the Scopes trial. You've all heard that William Jennings Bryan, who was the prosecutor against Scopes, was absolutely put on the pillory by Clarence Darrow, and that the movie Inherit the Wind says this, and that William Jennings Bryan ran into all sorts of problems because he believed that the Earth was 6,000 years old. He did not at all. William Jennings Bryan quoted this immediately. He said, as a good Christian, I'm quite prepared to say that the Earth is basically as old as God wants to make it. William Jennings Bryan believed in evolution, probably. He did not believe in human evolution. It's clear. But as far as the age of the Earth is concerned, he had no problem with an old Earth. Young Earth creationism is actually, it's a Seventh-day Adventist invention, and it dates to Genesis flood in 1961. So it's the whole idea of the Earth only being 6,000 years old, even in evangelical fundamentalist circles, is very young, if you know what I mean. Anyhow, what I want to say is, God is outside space and time. If multiverses exist, and of course, as you know, there are lots of people now are suggesting that maybe there are many different universes, then it seems to me that if we did occur, we did evolve, so we could evolve, God could just keep going on multiverses. He could just keep creating more and more multiverses until humans did occur. Now you might say, well, this is going to take a long time, but God's outside time and space. God, that's not his problem. So what I'm suggesting is, at least possibly, this might be a way to do it. Now you might say, yeah, but isn't this a hell of a waste? God, he's making 1, 2, 3, 5 billion and 1, 5 billion and 2, 5 billion and 3, still not getting there. Well, just keep going, just as well I'm out of space and time, isn't it? Well, he got this problem already, as the 19th century pointed out, the plurality of world. Even in this universe, we've got a hell of a lot of the universe which doesn't bear humans, and God was happy to create it. So clearly, I'm not saying that's easy to accept, but I'm saying it does happen. So what I'm suggesting is, maybe a way to help Christians on this is to suggest multiverses, and that maybe that would be a way that humans occur, not necessarily here, but somewhere else. So even here, I think that there's possibility you can reconcile Darwinism and Christianity. One final thing, why the hell am I giving you this lecture, other than the fact I'm being paid $5,000 as an honorarium? There's a surcharge on your fees next year to pay for me. Why on earth am I doing this? I'll tell you why I'm doing this. Is because I think that this whole question of Darwinism and religion is not just a philosophical or theological issue, I think it's a political issue. I think that there's a lot of people in our society are very keen, well, we know that, to stop evolution being taught or to allow creationism to be taught in biology classes. And I think that would be a real moral evil. I don't think we should do that to our children or our children's children. I worry myself that with people like Dawkins pushing Darwinism equals atheism equals Darwinism, before very long, as they're already doing, I think that the intelligent design people are going to seize on this and go to the courts and say, look, you know, we're not allowed to teach our stuff because it's religion. You know, at a certain level, Darwinism is a religion too. It may not believe in God, but it's making religious claims, namely that there is no God. So sauce for the goose is sauce for the gander. Now you might say that's a bad argument, but our Supreme Court rather welcomes bad arguments. You know, our Supreme Court, lets, people gun down little black boys in Florida. Our Supreme Court lets the Koch brothers, buy elections like you wouldn't believe. I could just keep going, one after another. So I think that this is a political issue as well as being just a philosophical and theological issue. But let's just keep it at that level tonight. So that's it, folks. Can Darwinism be reconciled with Christianity? Yes, but it's not easy. But whoever said that the important things in life are easy?